What It Looks Like to Us and the Words We Use by Ada Limon, the current Poet Laureate of the United States. All these great barns out here in the outskirts, black creosote boards knee-deep in the bluegrass. They look so beautifully abandoned, even in use. You say they look like arks after the seas dried up. I say they look like pirate ships. And I think of that walk in the valley where Jay said, "You don't believe in God." And I said, "No. I believe in this connection we all have to nature, to each other, to the universe." And she said, "Yeah, God." And how we stood there, low beasts among the white oaks, Spanish moss, and spider webs, obsidian shards stuck in our pockets, woodpecker flurry, and I refused to call it so. So instead, we looked up at the unruly sky, its clouds in simple animal shapes we could name, though we knew they were really just clouds, disorderly and marvelous and ours. I'm really honored to be here today to present my thesis that poetry can build community. In addition to having the honor and distinction of being Woodbury's current Poet Laureate, I also have the privilege of being a public school English teacher at Litchfield High School, where I teach freshmen, and I fill their year with poetry from beginning to end. And I take a page out of my father's child-rearing book, "You Can Learn to Love Anything." And that was his advice to me when it was meatloaf night, and it's my advice to my students when it's poetry time, which is 180 days worth of instruction. I would like to start with a poem by a fabulous writer, Neil Gaiman. It is called "What You Need to Be Warm." He constructed this poem in 2019 at the beginning of the 8th year of the Syrian refugee crisis. And on his Twitter feed, he asked people to tell him, "What do you need to be warm?" He received about 25,000 words in response, and from those responses, he constructed this poem, "What You Need to Be Warm." A baked potato of a winter's night to wrap your hands around or burn your mouth. A blanket knitted by your mother's cunning fingers or your grandmother's. A smile, a touch, trust as you walk in from the snow or return to it. The tips of your ears pricked pink and frozen. The tink, tink, tink of iron radiators waking in an old house to surface from dreams in a bed, burrowed beneath blankets and comforters. The change of state from cold to warm is all that matters. And you think, just one more minute snuggled here before you face the chill. Just one. Places we slept as children, they warm us in memory. We travel to an inside from the outside, to the orange flames of the fireplace or the wood burning in the stove. Breath ice on the inside of windows, to be scratched off with a fingernail, melted with a whole hand. Frost on the ground that stays in the shadows waiting for us. Wear a scarf, wear a coat, wear a sweater, wear socks, wear thick gloves. An infant as she sleeps between us. A tumble of dogs, a kindle of cats and kittens. Come inside. You're safe now. A kettle boiling at the stove. Your family or friends are there. They smile. Cocoa or chocolate, tea or coffee, soup or toddy. What you know you need. A heat exchange. They give it to you. You take the mug and start to thaw. While outside, for some of us, the journey began as we walked away from our grandparents' houses, away from the places we knew as children, changes of state and state and state, to stumble across a stony desert or to brave deep waters, while food and friends, home, a bed, even a blanket remained just memories. Sometimes it takes only a stranger in a dark place to hold out a badly knitted scarf, to offer a kind word, to say, "We have the right to be here," to make us warm in the coldest season. you have a right to be here. So Neil Gaiman, prolific writer in just about every genre, created that poem that was then knitted into a scarf by Syrian women and sold to raise money for Syrian refugees. And yet he collected bits and pieces from people around the world responding to a Twitter feed. So what is poetry? What is creativity? I'll define my terms before I argue my case, that poetry is community. The 19th century British mathematician Ada Lovelace, daughter of Lord Byron, the poet, said the hallmark of creativity is the ability to compose something cohesive, original, and symphonic out of disjointed, seemingly dissonant parts. Sounds like family dinner, right? A definition of a functioning community. And I would define the term community, I think sort of a gentrified word that's been overused over the years to describe and label groups. I would stay away from that definition and say that a community is a group of people who come together for a shared purpose. And with that in mind, I think poems are a place to go, a place to be found, and a place to found. Or as the author of The Book Thief, Mark Zuzak, has said, the words were on their way. And when they arrived, she would hold them in her hands like the clouds, and she would bring them out like the rain. Words have power. Poetry has power. Poetry is the hallmark of the human experience and has been since we could first figure out how to hold a chisel and carve into clay tablets our ideas. And back to my English teacher experience, and the first text we start with is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the first known complete story. And it was found in the deserts of Iraq in the mid-19th century in bits and pieces that these British imperialists thought must be important. So we'll take them and we'll put them in the British Museum in London. And someday we'll figure it out. And sure enough, an Assyriologist named George Smith started playing around with these clay tablets, and he discovered the story of the flood, an archetypal story that we know from the Bible. And the great thing about this, he was so excited that he cracked the code of cuneiform that he started to take his clothes off and run around the British Museum. You gotta love it, right? That's how exciting it was to break this code and discover this story that is 4,000 years old. And Gilgamesh was a deeply flawed human being. He was a monster, but he was a good king. You know, we got that going on. And the people understood that he was a great leader, but he was a bad human being. So they appealed to their gods, help us with this guy. So the gods fashion his double in Enkidu. And he literally does battle with himself and moves towards a wholeness of his heart and spirit. He's not perfect yet, but he's better, right? He and Enkidu exchanged pieces of heart, like in your story, Christine. And they go on these amazing adventures. They steal lumber from Lebanon, not cool, but they do turn them into doors for the temple to the gods. Only the gods can go through these great cedar doors. So the flawed nature of humanity is throughout this text, and it's something my students struggle with, right? How can he be a hero, a king, if he isn't perfect? And it's what it means to be alive. And I think the magic of poetry is in the discovery of that poem, and the fact that this language that was invented to keep track of commercial transactions, business, right? The cash register of its time was transformed into the language of poetry. And in a documentary about the discovery of this text, David Damrosch of Harvard University says, you can't even work from a photograph of it because these cuneiform tablets are three-dimensional. You have to play with it to see the shadows cast into the little marks. You have to turn it under the light. His colleague at Yale, Ben Foster, says anyone who reads a cuneiform tablet has a special experience in front of them. They are reading something which someone else wrote 4,000 years ago. This is their actual handwriting in a piece of clay, and you do feel a kind of communion with these people. The manuscript you're looking at is the only one, and you're figuring out what it was they wrote. What a tremendous responsibility these people have with these texts and with these tablets. And thank goodness that we have them, that we have this inheritance. And it is a product of British imperialism, but there you go. We live in a complex world, and nothing's perfect for sure. And I would argue that Ben Foster and David Damrosch are talking about a community of human beings that have spanned millennia to capture what it means to be alive. And I would just like to share a brief passage from the Epic of Gilgamesh. This most recent translation by a woman, it has a very kind of Beowulf vibe if you read it. The prose is very tight and it's wonderful. The poetry, the language. But it's a great story that begins where it ends. This guy who can't appreciate what he's got goes on all these adventures and comes back to what he's got. And he's like, oh yeah, that's pretty good. You know, and that is the story of life. But so the book ends where it begins. Jenny Lewis writes, surpassing all kings, his name is a legend. His people kept safe in the sheepfold of Uruk. Unmatched in combat, none could defeat him. Mighty and handsome, a glorious hero. The full womb, the still grave, the weight of life, heavy as a flood, how the waters broke, how the world was birthed. Gilgamesh knew. He understood. 4,000 years ago. Not bad, right? You know? And just to travel forward a couple millennia, we have our boy Homer writing the chronicles of the Trojan War in the Iliad. And it's a gruesome book to read. It's just one list of dead after another. And it is a great text that protests war in a very big way. But in the midst of that battle over Troy, you get this incredible insight into what it's like to be a soldier during these bloodbaths. And you have Hector, the great warrior Hector, encountering his wife Andromache for the last time, and she is holding their infant son. And just hear these words, please, and be in community with Homer, this text, in that time. He stretched his arms towards his child, but the boy cried and nestled in his nurse's bosom, scared at the sight of his father's armor, and at the horsehair plume that nodded fiercely from his helmet. His father and mother laughed to see him, but Hector took the helmet from his head and laid all gleaming upon the ground. Then he took his darling child, kissed him, and dandled him in his arms, praying over him the while to Jove and to all the gods. Jove, he cried, grant that this my child may be even as myself, chief among the Trojans. Let him be not less excellent in strength, and let him rule Ilius with his might. Then may one say of him as he comes from battle, the son is far better than the father. May he bring back the bloodstained spoils of him who he has laid low, and let his mother's heart be glad. With this, he laid the child again in the arms of his wife, who took him to her own soft bosom, smiling through her tears, as her husband watched his heart yearn toward her, and he caressed her fondly, saying, my own wife, do not take these things too bitterly to heart. Wow, oh my gosh, right, Bronze Age, kinder times at Bronze Age. But here you have a husband and a wife loving their child in a time of war, not knowing what the future holds, offering each other what love and compassion they have. And it doesn't end well for the Trojans, unfortunately. And it's an interesting epic because written by a Greek guy, not cutting his people any slack. Oh my gosh, they're brutal, they're dishonorable in the terms of engagement for the time, which would be head-to-head combat, not sneaking around with wooden horses and people packed inside. But there it is. There's an honesty about human nature in poetry that makes it not only a place of self-discovery and discovery of history, but a place to find heart and take peace. You know, and much later comes, in Homer's life, comes the Odyssey. And old Odysseus, he's full of obligations to other kings because Helen got kidnapped for another time. And they keep promising all the Achaean kings, every time she gets kidnapped, we go get her. And they do, and he doesn't want to because he's got a brand new wife, a baby, and he's got things to do on Ithaca. But he goes, and he's not exactly Mr. Integrity on the way home because he stops in, he's a playboy for about, well, let's just say a long time, right? And finally he gets home. But he only gets home with the help of his mother. That's how it goes, right? So you have this mighty human being, and we're all trying to be that in some way. The expectations that Hector has for his son to exceed him, what every parent wants for their child, it's a tall order, and it's scary sometimes, right? But you have Odysseus wandering the Mediterranean, and finally Circe tells him, look, you got to go to the underworld. You got to see Tiresias. He's going to tell you what to do. Do what you're told. Try something new, Odysseus. He goes to the underworld. He blows past his mother because he got told to do what he was told. But there's mom in the underworld. So once he gets it figured out, he goes back. And he's recounting this after he's been rescued for the last time before he goes back to Odysseus. But in his tale, he describes his encounter with his mother in the underworld. And this is the text I returned to when my mother passed away in 2019. And it was my source of comfort. It was my holy book. It was my connection with the grief and the sorrow that human beings have dealt with from the beginning of time. The age-old question, where does the spirit go? We want to know. We know it goes somewhere. And here is Odysseus telling his audience during a banquet. He's in the underworld, and he says, "And I, my mind in turmoil, how I longed to embrace my mother's spirit, dead as she was. 3 times I rushed toward her, desperate to hold her. 3 times she fluttered through my fingers, sifting away like a shadow, dissolving like a dream. And each time the grief cut to the heart, sharper, yes. And I cried out to her, words winging into the darkness. 'Mother, why not wait for me? How I long to hold you, so even here in the house of death, we can fling our loving arms around each other, take some joy in the tears that numb the heart. Or is this just some wraith that great Persephone sends my way to make me ache with sorrow all the more?' My noble mother answered me at once. 'My son, the unluckiest man alive, this is no deception sent by Queen Persephone. This is just the way of mortals when we die. Sinews no longer bind the flesh and bone together. The fire in all its fury burns the body down to ashes. Once life slips from the white bones and the spirit, rustling, flitters away, flown like a dream. But you must long for the daylight. Go quickly. Remember all these things, so one day you can tell them to your wife. Go and live your life.'" It's the message at the end of Gilgamesh, at the end of the Odyssey, even at the end of Beowulf. We can't do this without Beowulf, right? Doesn't get read much anymore, but another story of people fighting the darkness, fighting the unknown, treating the unknown like an enemy. You know, Beowulf is going to go sort out what's going on with that monster. And he does, but then Beowulf's mother finds out. Never mess with mothers, but when you've got an epic mother on your hands, you better hit the decks. Just don't even go there. And she comes back and settles the score to the best of her ability, and it goes on. And I would like to just share sort of my take on what she is about in terms of the pantheon of epic mothers. And this is a poem I wrote a couple years ago called Archetype. And it was a task we were given at a Bard Institute for Thinking and Writing workshop on taking a text. And this happened to be T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. And we had to make it mean something to us, and we had 40 minutes, and it was a beautiful day, and the landscapers were out back with the leaf blowers. It was like, what am I going to do? So anyway, I gave it my best shot, and I found that I did what I do, which is return to the big guys. This is called Archetype, and it starts with a line from Eliot. "It seems as one becomes older that the past has another pattern and ceases to be a mere sequence. So it seems, tumbling through time to Grendel's lair, where the deep fear of pattern makers keeps him home days, until chaos intrudes on gold gathering, a night battle, brutality, lost arms, and a mother who would have the last word. Home is home, and who belongs where? I would fight to the end for you, fight to know where you are, to find you here. I go back through ghost stories to Odysseus in the underworld, searching in the dark of memory. For mother's love becomes spirit, so strong he saw her, heard her, followed her word, went home like a ghost, as if for the first time. Heartache, heartbreak, broken heart, you are the star of her universe. She would have you burn bright. I go back again to the first story, a mother's blessing, a search for eternity. Go back, you fool, find it where you began. Dig deep in the sand, unearth the pattern of time. This dazzling, eternal moment is yours to find. Dance to the beat of your own wild pulse. Go home. Stop breaking my heart." So these are the stories that I land on the heads of 13 and 14-year-olds And then we have debates about who the greater hero is and what makes a hero and what missteps are forgivable and which ones aren't. And it builds community in the classroom because kids have to really think about what they believe and how they can support it. And it becomes this incredible community. And I think what is really remarkable right now, and maybe a gift to us from COVID and quarantine and the Zoom gods, is Zoom, right? And opportunities for people to be together in community. And as I said, if community is people joined by a shared purpose, very often that purpose is the poems people have searched and found in their hearts. And a good piece of that in Connecticut is this Sustainable Connecticut movement, where towns are instituting poets laureate to promote literacy in their communities, and the people who are in those roles are connecting with other poets laureate to try to create meaningful experiences and build community through poetry. And that's pretty amazing. We got a lot wrong in our world, but think about that people are thinking about poetry. And there are open mics at Arts Escape here in Southbury, at Studio Hill, in Woodbury. The Connecticut Poetry Society sponsors an open mic every month, the brewery in Woodbury. And through all these resources, there are discussion groups, and hit any library website and you will find that there's a poetry group meeting and people writing, reading, or sharing. And I've had the privilege, in my capacity as poet laureate, I've worked with some seniors at the Woodbury Senior Center, and they didn't really want to get academic with it. They just wanted to hit on a poem that was interesting and read it. And we had a lot of fun just reading poems and connecting as people through the poem. And one of the best conversations was some poetry of Taylor Swift. And as Glenn's homework, he was watching the videos of her swimming around in the champagne glass and having a grand time. So, but what a great conversation about music now, music then, and what a daring young woman Taylor Swift is. And we have poetry contests and readings and writing groups. And with the help of my husband, the techie Ed Zicko, I have been running a couple podcasts. One of them is People and Their Poems. And I've connected area poets with the more known poets and the influences that they identify as being meaningful to them as writers. And one of the poets I interviewed was a gentleman named Jack Powers. He's down in Reading, Connecticut. And we had a great conversation, and he said, I have under no illusion that anybody will be reading my poems in 100 years. Did not stop him from publishing his second book and being a part of a poetry group for the past 30-odd years and connecting with other people who care about expressing their experience of being alive through language as accurately and as meaningfully as possible. This is what's happening here. In Woodbury at the public library, our chapter of the Connecticut Poetry Society, we call it the Oronog chapter, which I thought was really clever because when you climb Mount Oronog, you can see 5 towns. But I've had to spend more time explaining that that's why those are the 5 towns. I should have just named the towns. But anyway, it's when your cleverness comes back to get you, I guess. But we've been doing ekphrastic poetry writing, which is simply writing about the art in the gallery. And it's connected us with the local artists who have put their heart and their souls on the canvases that we've looked at and the paper. And right now, the student art show is up, the Nanuwag seniors. And I got to tell you, everybody wanted to write about Helena's stuff, so we had to spread it out. I mean, there's such moving, beautiful stuff that our young people are capable of. And now we have some really cool middle-aged people coming down to write poetry about what young people see in life at a very young age. And you see how insightful they are. And it's been a very interesting community-building experience. Marla at the library calls it a symbiotic relationship. And it's an interesting kind of thing because we want to get it right. We want to do right by the artists. We want to do right by the experience of the art. And so you're searching your soul for your best self and the best version of what you have. And it's been a very powerful experience that way. And so these are some experiences of poetry as a source of building community and connecting. When our chapter meets every third Saturday at 9:30 in the morning on Zoom, it's to share a poem, get some feedback on it, just read it, and talk about what's going on in the world of poetry in art. So it is about being alive in community. I'm going to just kind of bring it back to my original statement there, and I would like to close this with a poem called Cornish Words by Donald Draw from this book, which I got down at Bird's Books in Bethel, really lovely independent bookstore with everything in it, very accommodating people too. And it is written by, or collected by a man named Chris McCabe, and he launched the Endangered Poetry Project in 2017, and if this isn't scary, he collected the poems of languages, written in languages that are dying. So you hold this book in your hands and you realize a lot of these languages are probably gone. These are artifacts. And it's an incredible book. I highly recommend it. I will read Cornish Words and read it as an invitation. Cornish Words by Donald Draw, translated by Tim Saunders. What shall we do with you, our Cornish words? Shall we dance with you or portray icons? Speak wise sayings, simple childish rhymes? Argue politics or philosophy? Why not write love letters? Perhaps more intended by them than is revealed. Sometimes I think all this is a waste of time and effort, for all words disguise what we truly wish to say. How then can we use our foolish, fond words, beloved and enchanted words, wild words which run away with us? Hold up the mirror to our thoughts, breathe on it, wipe it clean, let us begin again. Perhaps year after year, age after age, we shall find at least a true lost meaning, not in our bardic lines, but between those lines, shadowed, hinting at the essence, something of what we hope to signify.